UFC's a powerhouse. The fights and the champions really get everyone riled up, but despite the contagious energy of the matches, some of them just fall flat. Here's a rundown of some of the most disappointing UFC fights of all time, starting with a super fight, Royce Gracie versus Ken Shamrock. Now, this one was a total miracle fight, not in the sense that it was good, it really was not, but in the sense that the UFC actually managed to overcome its aftermath, since it was UFC's first super fight. Well, here's what happened. For starters, Shamrock
it means a lot to me to go into this fight and perform the way I know how to perform and be able to go out on top.
And Gracie,
I talk about I'm back. You heard it, Royce Gracie is
spent a large part of the first half hour just kinda grappling around. Nothing at all happened, and referee John McCarthy stepped in to have both the fighters stand up. Ultimately, the fight was called off after just 35 minutes. Unexcitingly, it ended in a draw because there were no judges. The audience was just thanking their lucky stars that it wrapped up as soon as it did, because it was meant to go on for 2 hours. Yikes. Anyway, this next fight's one that turned out to be so dull, the UFC had to go back to the drawing board and introduce some rule changes. Dan Severn versus Ken Shamrock. In the early days of the UFC, these two were super popular, so of course, their fight was highly anticipated, but it should not have been. Back then, the UFC fights had a single round that lasted 30 minutes. In this case, Shamrock,
I'm like, we did a match and he goes over on me on one of the matches and I was like, okay.
and Severn just spent that time circling each other without any contact. The UFC was forced to take notice as some of these issues had been present in other matches too. Much needed rule changes were later duly implemented. Well, this next fight's one that had folks wondering whether the competitors were meant to engage or play catch me if you can. Nate Quarry versus Caleb Starnes. If you talk to UFC fans, there's pretty much an all-around unofficial consensus that this was one of the worst fights in the entire history of the organization. Caleb spent 3 rounds just running away from Quarry.
30 seconds remains of the fight. Oh, wow. Nate Quarry.
This earned him an embarrassing nickname too, the Running Man. In some not-so-shocking news though, Starnes never fought again in the UFC after this fiasco. Caleb's fight seemed to have left him, really, and this kinda just sucks the excitement right out of a match. In this next fight, something similar happened too. Spoiler alert, it got kinda boring. Kimbo Slice against Houston Alexander.
That Kimbo probably expected him to come charging right at him, and so he's showing him some different looks.
Slice really had things going for him as a street fighter. The man was super entertaining, but sadly, none of that energy really made it into the octagon. In this fight, Slice put in a great effort to pressure Alexander, and there were some good moments there, but Alexander was just pretty content to stay on the defense. And so, by the time the 3rd round rolled around, both fighters just looked done, and the audience mirrored the sentiment too. This next match was supposed to be a redemption fight. Who knew fighting for redemption could be so unexciting? Francis Ngannou versus Derek Lewis. After Ngannou had been beaten in an embarrassing fashion in his title fight with Stipe Miocic, his fight against Derek Lewis was super hyped as a redemptive battle. Both the competitors could have really shined. I mean, the heavyweight title was hot and up for grabs. Instead of witnessing 2 champions who could be the next challengers for the belt, the audience got a snooze fest. In the end, the judges gave the fight to Derek because his 20 significant strikes were just barely enough to get a nod over his opponent. Dana White summed it up pretty decently when he said that Ngannou's ego was running away with him. Kind of a bummer, but it's the fighting game, and it takes just a couple of seconds to be humbled. Now, this next fight could totally be used as proof that sequels aren't all that great. Tim Sylvia versus Andrei Arlovsky. The time when this took place wasn't too great for the heavyweight division of the UFC. Andrei had beaten Tim and won the interim UFC Heavyweight Championship at UFC 51. Later on, during UFC 59, Sylvia managed to regain the title. The two faced each other again at UFC 61 and fought their worst fight so far. It was so bad that it was pretty evident that the fans and the two fighters didn't want to ever revisit it. No one ever expected it to be this underwhelming. But in the case of this next fight, maybe some signs were there. Randy Couture versus James Toney.
Yeah, we used to, right. He was Sylvester Stallone.
This super hyped fight had just a teensy tiny little pairing flaw. Tony had no experience in grappling, and so, unsurprisingly, Couture managed a takedown just 15 or some seconds into the fight. He totally dominated and went in for an arm triangle choke that wrapped up the match. All in all, there was no competition here. It was a clear matchup error, it seemed. However, sometimes brilliant pairings can also disappoint. Proof: Frank Mir versus Mirko Cro Cop. Okay, now this one really had potential, which is what made it so sad that it never lived up to it. Cro Cop had legendary striking capability, and Mir was an incredibly talented heavyweight. On paper, the two facing off would have made for some amazing stuff. However, the fight came at a time when both of the men were nearing the conclusion of their careers. And weirdly enough, this kinda reflected in their energy too. Both were pretty afraid to lose and so resisted engaging the entire fight. Come on! It was so disappointing that even its end with an awesome third-round knockout couldn't make up for the letdown. And that's saying something. Speaking of stuff that was just not entertaining, next is Anderson Silva versus Thales Leites. The reluctance to engage in a fight makes the whole experience lose energy and meaning, and Thales just didn't want to engage with Anderson on the feet. All throughout this 5-round experience, Leites just avoided Anderson as much as he could. He just took any chance he got to fall on his back, hoping he'd lure Anderson into his guard. It was just awful to watch. The next fight highlights another truth that can make a UFC fight dull. No one wants to watch an unnecessary fight, as in the case of Tito Ortiz versus Ken Shamrock. I mean, it would have been pretty okay had this fight never happened, but it did. Even before this fight, Tito had already beaten Ken not once, but twice. Once with a corner stoppage, the other time was somewhat controversial because it was done through an early stoppage by the referee. But in the fight that had been stopped early, it was clear that Tito was about to win. Had it continued, that would have been the outcome minus the controversy. In a classic history repeating itself phenomenon, the third fight went much like the first two. Tito had Shamrock with a first-round knockout, and the trash talking was pretty bad too. Even sitting through that was hard. Another hard-to-watch fight happened between Israel Adesanya versus Yoel Romero. Since both men relied on aggressive engagement from their opponents, their bout just was uneventful. In a total of 5 rounds, Adesanya managed only 48 strikes, while Romero got 40. Plus, Romero couldn't succeed on 3 non-committal takedown attempts. In the end, Adesanya won, but it was only due to his low kicks. The performance was enraging for all watching, and not in a good way. From bad pairings to hesitating when engaging, these were some of the most disappointing UFC fights of all time.